Simultaneous with the Cold War was an era of real prosperity for many Americans, the 1950s. We had a very popular Republican president, Eisenhower, who, of course, we already saw as a general during World War II, and full employment for most people. The way of life for many Americans improved, their standard of living, but it paid to be a white American male in the 1950s. If you see here, here's Eisenhower, of course, looking older as the president. Here is a American kitchen advertised in the 1950s. And I don't know how many of you see your parents in the kitchen, but it is rare that I empty the dishwasher or set the table dressed in my beautiful dress and pearls. And my husband does not usually help me with a tie. This ad here is for Pepsi Cola, and it says, "Enjoy the modern light refreshment." If you look at the picture, again, it's nothing of sacrifice or service that we saw in World War II. It's a skinny woman enjoying listening to records and drinking Coca-Cola with her male friend. So where did this prosperity come from? For many returning servicemen, they were beneficiaries of the GI Bill. The GI Bill was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And if you think about many of these men who served in World War II, they grew up during the Depression. Many of them have limited education and limited financial means before the war. The GI Bill gave millions and millions of dollars for college tuition, for low-interest mortgages and business loans. It gave 1-year unemployment insurance if they couldn't get a job right away. And this propelled millions of Americans into the middle class. Still, immediately after they returned from war, there was inflation, there was housing shortages when you bring millions of Americans back, and there were strikes because many American companies, just like we saw after World War I, were like, we did our part, World War II, where's the benefit now? What did we see? We saw millions of American men returning, anxious to find a wife and anxious to start a family. From 1946 to 1964, 76 million babies were born, including me, Mrs. Emerson. And this period of time was known as the baby boom. Now look at this picture here on the left. That undoubtedly is a posed picture. But the population of the United States went through the roof, and the vast majority of people in the United States were under 15. Veterans returned, got married, and started families. The greatest number of births was in 1948 till this day. So think about what a baby boom does to restructuring what American life looked like. However, all was not wonderful. There was an anti-union climate after World War II, and we saw unions make great strides in 1930 in the 1930s during the New Deal. In 1947, a law was put into place called the Taft-Hartley Act that was passed over Truman's veto, and it restricted union activities, and it said that businesses were no longer to be able to have a closed shop, which was an agreement that employers must only hire union members. Today, for example, as a Medfield teacher, I do not have to join the union, although most teachers do. 1948, we saw Truman up for his own election. If you remember, he came into office after FDR died in April of 45, and he ran against Thomas Dewey, who of course was one of Roosevelt's last opponents. Look at this newspaper. There's something wrong with it. It says Dewey defeats Truman. It was a very, very close election, and many southern states were opposed to Truman's stand on civil rights. They felt he was too friendly to the Negro. And Truman won with 49.5% of the popular vote. As we learned when we looked at the Cold War in the last few weeks, many people thought that Truman was not tough enough on communism. So here we are for a man who gets criticized for his stand on civil rights and his stand against communism, and years later, he's usually considered one of the top 15 presidents in U.S. history. Look at this map. If you notice, there's a different color here, the orange, which is the states' rights Democrat. And a man by the name of Strom Thurmond ran as a Democrat because they didn't like the civil rights aspect of Truman, and he got many Southern votes. This is the slight beginning where we're starting to see Southern states turn more Democratic than Republican. So what were some of these changes? If you look at this picture here, this is the beginning of the suburbs. We have all these GIs returning, marrying, having many children, and the GI Bill allowed many to buy their own homes. The goal, the American dream, was no longer to be a renter, but to be a buyer. New roads linked suburbs to jobs in the cities, so men could take the train, take the highway to get to work, and return to their suburban home in the 1950s. Medfield, prior to about mid-60s, was considered a rural farm town until the trains were put through in Medfield. Along at this time period, as we mentioned last week, television was beginning to become omnipresent in the American home, and television promoted the idea that a woman's proper place was at home. Look at these statistics. We go from Rosie the Riveter to the smiling, well-dressed, high-heeled suburban American housewife. People married younger in the 1950s. The median age for first marriage was 22.8 for a man and 20.3 for a woman. What does that tell you? It tells you that many, many women did not graduate from college. Many women did not go to college. And this wasn't for lack of finances. This was because it was not seen as a proper role. Today, ladies and gentlemen, Massachusetts is the oldest marrying state in the country. Another photo of a happy American housewife cooking dinner as her husband comes home in his suit and is waiting for dinner there on the radiant stove. Tonight, I got off a Zoom happy hour with my friends and my husband made dinner. Take a look at Google Classroom and you'll see an example from 1955 for the Good Wife's Guide. Gender roles were very narrow, and a woman was expected to find fulfillment as a wife and mother. Election of 1952. One of the best phrases used in all time. Campaign slogan, I like Ike. Eisenhower versus a Democrat by the name of Adlai Stevenson. If you think back, this is the first time that a Republican has taken office since 1928 with Hoover. What do we know about Eisenhower as a president? He was a much better general than he was a president. He promised to end the stalemate in Korea, which in 1953 he did, but as we know, was that a colossal failure or a win? It was really just an armistice, I guess, and the fragile peace continues today, but Korea is still a divided country. Many Americans prospered in the 1950s. There were plentiful jobs. Families could buy a house and raise a family on one income. But again, this was mostly for white middle-class families. For African Americans, life was not that much better than it had been before. Eisenhower spent 2 terms as president from 1952 until 1960. He was conservative. He believed big business was essential to the U.S. And again, if you think back to the 1920s, this is fairly similar. But he did do and push money towards things that he felt were very helpful to the United States. For example, most of the highways in the United States today were funded during his terms as president. So he did push for money to be spent on activities that would benefit a bulk of Americans. He also fought against communism, and his beliefs were slightly different than Truman's. He believed that the United States should do its best to fight against communism, but in particular, he was concerned with the Middle East. So go to Google Classroom and see the video link on the Eisenhower Doctrine.